10 years since the Arab uprisings, Arab revolutions, and there are major differences and polarizations in the interpretations of what actually happened during these revolutions, what happened to them and after them. And I think one of the most important questions in Arab politics today is how to read the last 10 years of Arab modern political history. There are various ways of potentially reading those 10 years. One of them, which is quite prominent in the West, particularly amongst politicians, looks at the idea of transition, societal transition. Political transition, so from a dictatorial, authoritarian, totalitarian system towards supposedly liberty, freedom, multi-party political system, a democracy. And economic transition from a weak economy that is uncompetitive, typically dominated by the state, towards a strong economy able to sustain itself, to lift its society, and one that typically is led by the private sector, of course in a regulated way. The problem is that 10 years on, we do not have any single example in the Arab world of a successful societal transition in both political transition and economic transition. This leads to a second reading, which is quite prominent amongst academics in universities. And that one focuses on the political economy. The idea is that across the Arab world, not just in different countries, but really across the region, there are very strong interests, economic interests, financial interests, and not only in the last 10, 15 years, rather in the last 30, 40 years. And that those interests have partnered up with political powers, again, in different countries and often powers across the region. Together, these economic financial interests and political powers formed the prevailing political economy. You can say the ruling structure. In this reading, the past 10 years was basically a set of struggles between the political economic prevailing structure that obviously does not want any major changes. It can effect small, cosmetic, surface, superficial changes, but it does not want a real change in the essence of the ruling structure, versus large groups of people in almost all societies across the Arab world that see that this prevailing political structure did not give it political opportunities, freedom, or economic opportunities, economic benefits. And therefore, for these vast segments of the population, they want major changes, not just cosmetic changes. And therefore, again, in that reading, the last 10 years is a set of struggles between those who want major changes, revolutionary forces, versus the power structure that does not want any change and therefore is against the idea of revolution in the Arab world. There is a third reading which you find prominent or prevalent amongst people who are very interested in the history of the Arab world, the modern history, the last 150 years in this part of the world. In this reading, they say the main problem that is always recurring in the Arab world, including in the last 10 years, is that almost all Arab societies, if not all of them, have repeatedly failed to find a consensus or very large societal agreement regarding the fundamental questions of politics, legitimacy, political legitimacy, the social contract between the state and the people, how to sustain a really growing, independent, sustainable, free middle class, the role of religion. Here, religion, by the way, is Islam and Christianity. So the role of religion in society. And again, in this reading, the Arab world in the last 150 years has been experimenting with different solutions, different answers to this set of questions, and every time it does not arrive at a big set of social segment that agrees. There is always polarizations on these fundamental questions. And so, in this view, the last 10 years was nothing more than another cycle of that. Here, the focus obviously is not on political or economic transition. It's not on the idea of the political economy and the struggles between power structures versus sections of the people. No, it's on the developmental experiences of the Arab world over effectively the entire history of its exposure to the world since it opened up in the early mid-19th century. So obviously it's a much more entrenched problem if you look from this reading. There is a fourth reading, and that one says all of these readings are good, are okay, they are intelligent in one way or another, but they are details. In this fourth reading, the real issue is geopolitical, as in the Arab world, again in this view, remains by and large an area in which there are major interests for large powers outside the region, whether in Europe, in the US, China, Russia, others, and that there are projects that have regional components, regional partners, but they are largely external projects that want still to continue to control different parts of this region. And therefore, there are struggles between these different projects. Often, these struggles are manifested through confrontations between regional players, but in reality, in this reading, the struggles, the confrontations are between big projects controlled by external players from outside the region. This view or reading also says that in the last 15-20 years, the Arab world also started to export to the world a set of problems, and that these problems led some international players also to think that different parts of the Arab world need to be contained. And therefore, in this fourth reading, the projects do not only struggle to control the Arab world or parts of the Arab world, but often to contain them as well. Personally, I think all of these four readings tackle the last 10 years from different angles. They all, in my view, provide part of the truth. But the important point, I think, is that 10 years since these dramatic developments that occurred at the end of 2010, early 2011 in the Arab world, it is crucial for us to revisit them and rethink about them, irrespective from which angle one feels is right or closer to the truth. The point is to reflect on this very important decade, because I think it is going to have a huge bearing on the immediate future in the coming few years.